Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to Muslim Matters podcast, Man2Man, where we bring guests to speak about different issues impacting our deen, our families, and communities. And we benefit from the experiences and stories of Muslim men. These are fathers, husbands, brothers, sons, uncles, and friends. Today, I, Irtaza Hassan, am joined by my co-host, Siraj Muhammad, the acting executive director of Muslim Matters, and we have with us a special guest, Belal Khan, who I first met as one of the early pioneers of Al Maghrib Institute, probably 20 years ago, right around the time I met Siraj. Belal professionally is what he describes a marketer by day, a specialist around marketing, and a martial artist by night. He has very recently, and for some time now, been on a journey into Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, and he's going to tell us a little bit about that. But the topic today that we're going to be delving into is physical preparation for the month of Ramadan. Our first podcast about Ramadan was about spiritual preparation for Ramadan with Dr. Yusuf Sher, and today we're going to talk more about getting your body ready. So first, let me say, welcome, Belal.
Hey, assalamu alaikum.
Good to have you on the show. Before we get into the topic of Ramadan, I'd like to ask you, tell us a little bit about Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu.
Sure. Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu is basically South American karate.
South American karate. Siraj, do you know what that is?
I know what Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu is. Actually, I got a little bit of training, very little, like maybe one or two lessons from brother Eddie from the Dean Show. He runs a studio out of Chicago, and he does Dawa, a lot of Dawa over there. He had an upstairs studio. I don't know if he still does, but he had one up there. So he would have brothers come downstairs, train with him, then he'd take them upstairs, and then he'd do his programs as well. So that's the extent of my experience. And then after that, whatever we watch, MMA and Khabib, of course. So that's my experience.
The fun fact about Eddie Redzovic, he's one of the first American representatives for Jiu-Jitsu under the banner of Gracie Barra in North America.
Now, how did you get into this Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu?
Okay, so...
Or what's the appeal? How did you get into it? What's the...
So I've been in martial arts my whole life. In third grade, my dad enrolled me initially in Taekwondo for a couple of years because I was near a school. We moved. Then we joined another school that, for all intents and purposes, in the 90s was what you would today consider MMA. But at the time, nobody knew what MMA was. After about a few years, that school got bought out. So the school was Master Glazier's Karate. But they did a hybrid fusion between karate and Taekwondo.
And this is when you lived in New Jersey.
This is when I lived in New Jersey. And now Mark Glazier, the founder of that school, wanted to get into nutrition. And so he sold his schools to Tiger Showman's Karate. Tiger Showman's Karate, they bought all of Mark Glazier's schools and branded everything under Tiger Showman's. Now, if you're in the Northeast, you're in New York or New Jersey, you are very familiar with Tiger Showman's MMA. Now, my teacher who ended up taking over the school, his name was at the time Sensei David Torelli. Now, everything was branded karate. The curriculum was designed such that when you come into the program, you first learn Kyokushin karate, which is a hard style of sparring karate in which they do bare knuckle style fighting. They incorporated Muay Thai, and then when you got into the advanced levels, they would bring in a style of grappling, which was a fusion between Jiu-Jitsu without a gi and traditional American style wrestling, or Greco-Roman wrestling as they call it. Now, at the time, I didn't know any of that was Jiu-Jitsu. I just knew it all as karate. Now, when I came to college, I remember I actually took a class that involved me going to LA. Now, LA is a hub for Jiu-Jitsu. At this campus, a bunch of guys are rolling on the ground, and I'm like, oh, they're grappling. Let me go check it out. And one guy is mounted on another guy, and he couldn't finish him. And so I'm like, hey, do this, do that, get him into a shoulder lock. And the guy's like, you know jiu-jitsu. I'm like, I don't know what that is. I know karate. And so later, when I come back to New Jersey, I find a couple other guys that know jiu-jitsu. And so the interesting thing was the jiu-jitsu that I learned, which I didn't know was jiu-jitsu, was essentially grappling, but with striking, which is what you see in the UFC today. And so that's kind of how I got introduced to it. Interestingly, in Tiger Showman's, a lot of their senseis are actually fighters in the UFC. My sensei himself is also a judge in the UFC. Yeah. So that was my introduction to it. When I left New Jersey, I wanted to continue my martial arts training. And I was in DC at the time, and I actually found a school that was training. It was a multidiscipline school. They had Krav Maga, which is what I was looking for at the time. It was being taught by a police officer, but in the same school there was Pedro Sawyer. He's one of the top guys in jiu-jitsu. He lives in Virginia, and he had an affiliate over there. Now, I didn't take any of the classes of jiu-jitsu, but it's one of those things that kind of got me exposed to it.
Okay,
Yeah.
let me ask you one question, because right as we jump into the show, two quick questions.
Yeah.
How young do people get into Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu?
I mean, people can start as young as 3.
Okay, another thing, someone listening to the show,
Yeah.
fathers and mothers, they got kids, Muslim families. What is one reason you would recommend Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu to young kids or parents who are looking for something for their kid?
Sure. I mean, okay, so I don't exclusively recommend jiu-jitsu. What I do recommend is find some sort of grappling art to teach your kids, right?
So whether karate, whether
So
jiu-jitsu-
karate is not is actually like 70% striking and maybe 30% grappling, but a grappling art would be anything along the lines of, say, jiu-jitsu, judo, wrestling, right? These are your top 3 most commonly found disciplines. Now, it depends on the school that you're at in terms of what are their allowances in terms of enrollment. So, like, for example, in the school that I'm at, I actually wanted my son to start with wrestling, not jiu-jitsu, but turns out that the minimum age for wrestling is, I think, 7. And so I'm like, all right, so jiu-jitsu it is.
Yeah.
And so they'll start jiu-jitsu at 3. Now, why jiu-jitsu over a striking art? Well, part of it is because the ability to grapple somebody is essentially your ability to de-escalate a situation, right? So if they got a bully or something, somebody's striking, somebody's hitting, it's better that they learn how to either nullify their hitting, or even if my kid is angry, I would rather him not hit and just start to, tackle somebody.
Yeah. No, alhamdulillah. Okay, with that, I'm gonna direct us to the show. That's actually a perfect kind of segue into the show. By the way, for people listening, you do not have to be a practicing jiu-jitsu or karate to want to learn about how to get physically ready for Ramadan. I do want to preface this show for listeners. We at Muslim Matters in the podcasting side, we try to have experts and specialists come on whenever we can to talk about different topics, whether deen related or dunya related, whether it's around therapy or counseling or medicine or legal issues. But sometimes we also have your regular speakers, fathers, people in the community who they have certain things that have worked for them, that they do. They're sharing advice. They're coming out and telling you how they've done things that have worked for them. And some of those can be replicated or repeated, and some may not work for everybody. Today, we're really going to look at our 2 guest speakers for that. And Siraj, actually, as my co-host, he's sometimes going to be interviewing and sometimes sharing. So it's going to be more of a discussion. I'm going to start one question for these guys, and I'm going to start with Siraj. There's so many topics that come around physical prep for Ramadan. One of the topics I hear every year, I hear this from imams at the masjid, I hear this, my mother has mentioned this for years, I hear this from elders, is it's not the food and drink that really gets us in Ramadan, it's the caffeine. And going without our daily chai or multiple cups of chai or that coffee, that latte, that soda. Some people, got to have a couple sodas a day. There's a strong caffeine dependency. And this is whether young people, elderly, everybody kind of has to have their different form of caffeine. I want to ask you guys, do you struggle with caffeine management in Ramadan? How do you prepare for it? How do you plan around it? I'd like both of you guys to comment on this. Siraj, let's start with you.
Bismillah. So yeah, I completely agree with you that caffeine is probably the biggest stumbling block for a good number of us. I wrote a tweet maybe a couple of years ago, and I put down a list of things that we need to prepare to do spiritually, mentally, physically, everything. And it was a list of about 5 or 6 items. And one of them was, cutting down the caffeine, cutting down the coffee or the chai, whatever it is. And that was the one that got the most reaction from people saying, "Oh my God, I am dreading this." So completely understand what you're saying. That is 100% true. So I say this as somebody who drinks a lot of caffeine, more than the recommended amount. From what I've read online from doctors and specialists, they say 400 milligrams of caffeine a day is what you should be taking in. I would strongly recommend you talk to your doctor if you drink a lot of caffeine like I do, and make sure those numbers are right and make sure you're taking a safe amount. But if you want to decrease your caffeine before Ramadan, it's really about just planning it out ahead of time. So you could start off by saying, okay, I'm only going to start taking caffeine in smaller amounts, like with smaller cups of coffee. You could start switching your regular cup of coffee to decaf occasionally. Um, I tend to be the type of person who drinks caffeine throughout the day, and I start to pull back in drinking it in the evening time. Now, a funny thing happens during Ramadan because I'll have been away from caffeine for so long. I will have like one cup in the evening to help me through the prayer, but otherwise, I won't be having caffeine throughout Ramadan.
Now,
So that's how I kind of.
Siraj, can I ask you, when you say in the
Sure.
evening, do you mean caffeine with the iftar, or like after Isha when it's getting into that Tarawih time and the night time, or are you talking about both?
Oh, I have it before Tarawih. In fact, it's to help me with Tarawih. So I like to have it right before Tarawih, just so that if I'm going to stay there for the whole time, sometimes it's okay if you're going to do 8 rakats when they're praying 20. Then it gets very easy to pray that because the recitation itself is short. Maybe they'll do 1 page per rakat. But if you're sitting in a masjid where they're doing the actual 8 rakats and they're doing 2.5 to 3 pages per rakah, and you're standing there, it can be pretty difficult after about the 4th or 5th. So it helps me to have that caffeine. I'm not sure that that's true for everyone. And look, I don't overeat when I have my iftar. But even without that going on, I still struggle to stay awake for the full prayer and to focus and concentrate. So the caffeine helps at that point. But in terms of decreasing it, I do start to pull back right before Ramadan comes around. And even as I decrease it, and I do get to that point where I'm not as heavy in the volume of caffeine I'm taking in towards the beginning of Ramadan, I'm still going to have that caffeine headache in the first few days, and that just has to be managed. You're going to have the caffeine headache, and it's going to come, for me at least. And so after a couple of days, it's okay, and then for the rest of the time, I'm having maybe 1 cup of coffee at night, and that's it.
No, I get it. Bilal, same thing. Do you do the caffeine headache? When he was saying that, I was smiling because we've all had it. How do you deal with caffeine in Ramadan? And I want to ask you, do you also have a habit where you try to get a little more at suhoor, get a little more at iftar? How do you deal with it? And do you get the caffeine headaches too?
So for me, I've been experimenting for about 4 or 5 Ramadan in terms of what has worked for me really well. So I think there's a couple of things that people misunderstand about what caffeine is and how to approach Ramadan in general. With relation to your energy, it's a combination of energy and stress management, right? So we consume caffeine, right, as a means of getting energy. But a lot of things that people don't recognize is that people are consuming caffeine wrong. All right. And what I mean by that is there's a number of factors, right? So when it comes to stress management, there's a hormone in our body called cortisol. Right? That is something that hormone essentially is what is within our system that really wakes us up out of our sleep. Now, what people do is that they will then right away, as soon as they wake up, they might hit their body with caffeine, not allowing the stress hormone that's already within them to be flushed out. And so one of the things that's recommended to do is you want to alleviate. How do you alleviate stress? Right? You alleviate stress by moving about, by exercising a little bit. Now, it's not in everybody's nature to like, hey, you know what, I'm gonna get up and start running or riding. Now, one of the things that I discovered when I was living in DC is that this was because I would commute to work on my bike, right? It was about a 10-mile ride each way. And during Ramadan is one of those things that came about. And it's one of those things that where after I learned about the biology of it, I was like, okay, this is why I'm able to get through it. When I didn't ride, because I lived in DC just about 4 years, and so each Ramadan was different because of the situation in the way that I was active. The Ramadan that hit me like a sack of bricks because of the caffeine is because I was completely sedentary. Right? You wake up, you take a shower or not, you get on the train, you sit for 35, 40 minutes, and then you go to the office and you sit for another 8 hours. Right? As opposed to you get up, you ride for 30 minutes. Right? And then you sit and you make yourself walk around and things like that. That riding for 30 minutes has flushed the caffeine out of your system, or not the caffeine, the cortisol out of your system, allowing you to, benefit. The challenge now is, when do you consume caffeine if you need to flush out the stress hormone? it's usually a good idea to wait about at least an hour, maybe two, ideally, to consume caffeine, so that, because what happens when you're consuming caffeine, it's not allowing, it's desensitizing you to fatigue sensors.
So in Ramadan,
Yeah.
you're probably getting it. This would be in the evening time.
So
You're
what
not
I will
talking
do,
about heavy caffeine at suhoor.
so I will try to wake up as early as possible, right? And then I will have caffeine at the very end, right? I will delay my suhoor as late as possible, right? So if I pray Fajr, now in an ideal scenario, I might get like maybe 40 minutes, at most an hour, right? But that should be just enough. Because
Yeah.
a lot of times people, what do? As soon as they wake up, cup of coffee. As soon as they wake up, a 5 hour. As soon as they wake up, a Red Bull or a Monster, right? But no, give yourself time to like do something. Even in this situation, like have your caffeine and then go for a walk, right? Don't go back to sleep after
So
suhoor.
so that may be a good segue for both you guys, and I'll say myself as well. You said go for a walk, which is some level of activity.
Yeah.
Do you guys do the same level of intense workouts that you do outside of Ramadan in Ramadan? And again, I know a lot of people listening might be like, well, we don't work out even outside of Ramadan. But if you do,
Yeah.
a walk is something a little more, I would say, less rigorous. What are your working out habits in Ramadan, or what have you guys seen works for you?
So for me, it's I'm still maintaining activity and exercise through Ramadan. It's just different. Okay. So
Different how?
okay. So for example, one of the things was when I came to Houston, when I moved to Houston proper, right? And I actually moved to Houston proper for two reasons. One was so that I can be close to Islam and Spanish, which is down the road. And the other was because there was the Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu school that I liked, which was about the same distance for
Yeah.
me. So I enrolled in that program about 2 weeks before Ramadan had started in 2018. So, and my thought process was, if I can train through Ramadan, I have no excuse to not train outside of Ramadan. And so now it's just a question of, when do you train? It's actually a good idea to train before you break your fast, right? Or if you can't do that, then it's a good idea. The second best idea is to train after you break your fast. And so what I would do my jiu-jitsu training 2 to 3 times a week, just before, an hour before iftar. The class would come in like around 6:30, and then after that I would break my fast right after class. And as the time shifts, I would just take a break in the class, have a protein bar and a date, some water, and then continue my training.
So okay, so
Yeah.
nothing having you break. Let me give 1 second here. Siraj, what about yourself? Working out, physical activity in Ramadan, and again, this was a segue from the caffeine discussion. Do you also work out in Ramadan? If you do, what does it look like? What has worked for you? What do you recommend?
So working out during Ramadan is an interesting problem, because a lot of times when people approach you about it, they say, Ramadan's coming. I'm not going to be eating as much. I'm going to be fasting. Isn't this a great time to start a workout program and lose weight? And I tell them, absolutely not. The time for that would have been throughout the year. When I look at Ramadan, I look at Ramadan primarily for getting spiritual benefit. But I'm not going to completely turn away all my working out and training in the middle of all that. So I reduce. I just like Bilal said, I change it up a bit, and I focus more on cutting. And throughout Ramadan, I'd say consistently, I have lost, whenever I've built up my weight, let's say throughout the year, I've lost about 8 pounds, and then kept it off. And the way I tend to do that is by simply making sure, as Bilal said, actually, I work out right before I break my fast. I don't do I don't do as intense of a workout as Bilal does. I think Bilal is probably a lot more intense and maybe more fit than I am. I'm very tired by the end of it, but I will try to do some. I'll do some heavy weight training, but with light volume, or I might get on the treadmill, and I may not walk in the morning like Bilal does, but I might walk in the evening and try to get some steps in. And then once I come to breaking my fast, very similar to Bilal, but for different reasons. I think he's training and having a protein bar and then continuing his training. When I come to break my fast at iftar, I know the biggest problem for all of us is that now we're ready, as Sheikh Yasser Bajaz say, you take revenge for not eating. And so you eat everything that you see, all the bhajiyas and samosas and everything, and the biryani, whatever is there, you just start like piling because you're starving, right? So I don't do that. I make sure that even if the food quality is not going to be exactly what I want, maybe it's a little oily, whatever, but I make sure the quantity stays down. And between the working out and the eating properly, I find that that's been very conducive and helpful for actually helping me lose weight during Ramadan. And then, of course, after Ramadan, you got to make sure on Eid day you don't like overdo it, and then you can keep it off from there.
So okay, and maybe another segue, and I know we'll jump around to a lot of topics, and again, all of us can jump into this, but I want to preface it that Siraj just talked about managing food consumption, and we know that the Muslim world has delicious food. Whether you're talking about some communities are predominantly Desi or Arab, to we'll have our East Asian brothers, we'll have Bosnians, Afghans, and you have so many delicious cuisines. How do you guys really manage? Because I know both of you guys are social. You're social in your masajid. You guys have families. You have in-laws. What do you do? What do you do in Ramadan? Or is it your exact same, the good habits you have throughout the year? Because I have personally found that Ramadan is very difficult. In fact, one thing I was talking recently to my wife about, in Houston, there's this new trend. It's like a fashion where people do these midnight, they call them suhoors, but they're not really suhoor, because suhoor obviously we know is delayed till closer to Fajr, but they're almost like social meetups. So it's like people have their iftar at the right time at Maghrib, and then there's a midnight meetup, and people are doing snacks, and then you'll have suhoor, and like Siraj said, it's comical, this idea that, hey, I'll start to get in shape in Ramadan, or I'll start a new diet. How do you guys manage this? And whoever wants to jump in can jump in.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Siraj, especially on the fact that if somebody wants to start a program in Ramadan, that's a bad idea, especially considering like any fitness program that somebody gets into, there is a 2-week adaptation period, right? So, and this is even in relation to Ramadan fasting, right? You want to give yourself a 2-week head start. I mean, if you got some fast to make up, those 2 weeks prior to Ramadan is the best time to do it, because then you'll be primed for the fasting in Ramadan. If you don't have fast to make up, then just do a couple extra fasts. At least get 3 days of consecutive fasting in. Like you got the 3 white days, you've got your Mondays and Thursdays. Sometimes they overlap, so you can get like 3-4 days like just back to back. So like take advantage of that to kind of get yourself primed. But with relation to food, like, yes, I know I'm generally tend to be social, but like during Ramadan, I'm actually a lot less social, right? And because I like having that schedule and that discipline is important, because for me, like the activity, it's not like I know it kind of seems intense, but it's not. In my case, when I'm training with jiu-jitsu, I'm actually being a lot more mindful in my training, not to overexert myself, focusing on the technique, focusing on drilling. And like I might train jiu-jitsu 2 or 3 times a week. And then an additional 2 days a week in the morning, when I still have energy from food, I'll hit the gym and do some weights. But again, it's not going to be intense. It's not going to be a 90-minute, 2-hour session with like 3 different circuits. I might just do 1 circuit, right? Just to kind of get that activity in. So, but with relation to food, it's like in the last few Ramadans, I think I can count, we would go to a gathering or a dawat or a masjid, maybe 2, maximum 3 times in the month at most.
Now, and before we get to Siraj, is that something you and your wife or you and your family plan, that, hey, we're going to restrict social outings, or we're going to be mindful that we're not overdoing it?
Yeah, for us, it's less about restricting and more about giving what we want the space and attention, right? So for us, it was like, all right, for me, I want to maintain the physical activity and at the same time be able to read X amount of Quran and attend the masjid a certain number of days, right?
Now that's really interesting. Siraj, I want to ask you the same question, because you and your family, your in-laws, are very well connected in the community, very well known. Do you also kind of, the same way you plan physical activity and do you plan your social activities in Ramadan, or limit them, or or work around what's more important? How do you manage that?
Well, in the Victoria community, I'm not so social actually, but I've in the past few years, I'd say I've actually gone through a number of different situations where I have I developed unique perspectives. So I think maybe between 2017 2020, my family had already moved to Victoria, and I was living by myself in the Bay Area. And so, I mean, I was alternating and visiting my family, but I was essentially living like the married bachelor lifestyle. So I had 2 other roommates. One of them was fresh out of college, working for Facebook, and the other one was a serial entrepreneur. So we're all living together, and we're basically 2 of them were trying to get married, and and I was with them and hanging out with them. So my lifestyle was more focused now on just personal ibadah and not really worrying about micromanaging my family and those concerns. And what ended up happening was I would go to the masjid, I would have iftar with the rest of the single brothers, and it was very easy for me to just have my own time to do Quran, to pray and get into the front row, all the things you want to do because you're only responsible for yourself. Now you have to have some goals. When I was by myself, it was very easy to do. Now that I'm back here, I'm with my family. I have other concerns again, right? So the focus again is more on making Ramadan good for the family and managing work and all the other concerns with that, and that's a little more complicated. So for me, as Bilal said, we're not really trying to go out of our way to have like midnight dinners and all these other things that you mentioned. It's more just about, hey, you know what, we have to like have our iftar. We want to spend some quality time together. We want to get some prayers in together. I think the pandemic made it very interesting too, where we had to pray at home sometimes as a family and do tarawih together. But overall, we're more focused on just getting to the masjid, praying, coming back, and I think maybe towards when I was living the married bachelor lifestyle, I think I could see myself probably doing the late night snacks at MCA in Santa Clara, the masjid where I was going to for my tarawih prayers. They kept the masjid open all night, and they have restaurants and everything attached. So the whole place would be packed with people, and it was very social. Everyone was there all the time. Even after the prayers ended, people didn't leave. They were just with their kids and having fun. It was a blast. So I would hang out with the single guys, and we'd be drinking chai all the way till 11:30, even after like, oh, eight rakat, I'm done, and then you're having fun talking, and it was a good experience. I can see some benefit in that, just so long as people make sure that they take care of all the other things like trying to do their khatam, making sure they get their tarawih in, and whatever their spiritual priorities are.
Now, Siraj, let me ask you a question. I don't want to put you on the spot. Obviously, now you're in, Victoria, BC, in Canada. You talked a little about the Bay Area, and you also have lived in Chicago. You've also, been well traveled.
Uh-oh.
Are there places that you remember most fondly when it comes to your Ramadans? Like you've lived in smaller towns, you've lived in big cities. Are there places where you're like, man, those were really some of the best Ramadans? And you don't have to answer that, or you could take it another direction. But since you've lived in multiple places in North America, I was wondering if you had, some city that you really looked at like, wow, those were really some special Ramadans, and if so, why? Why do you look fondly to those?
With Chicago, my Ramadan time was very limited simply because, I mean, at first all, I haven't been there many years, but I haven't lived there during Ramadan anyway. But the other side of it was I was living in a city that was further away from all of the main masajid in Chicago. There are some masjids there now in the area where my parents live and where I was staying, but they were not there when I was living there. So I didn't really have too much experience with Ramadan in terms of like the social atmosphere, but in terms of like the actual like the prayers, like praying at like IFS in Chicago was probably one of my better experiences. And then also I spent the last 10 nights in the masjid over there as well with my daughter. Had a good experience with that. So that would be very special for me in Chicago. In California with MCA, as I mentioned, I always had a great time over there. The masjid community is alive and well, and everyone is very good to one another for the most part. So that was a very positive experience too. Um, Let me see. And even in smaller communities, like I came from Purdue University. There's a masjid there in West Lafayette in Indiana. It's a college town, but the community there has so much barakah. The people there were always very filled with like energy during Ramadan, taking care of one another, taking care of the students. So there's a lot of different experiences you can have, whether you're a student or a family member or a single guy. The right community can make everyone feel welcome and not feel alone and feel like they're part of a larger whole. And that's important when you look at the fact that we're here in a non-Muslim country. Most people are not celebrating. They don't see the signs of Ramadan like they do Christmas and everything else. Good masjid activity for the kids, for the family, for the singles. I think it's all really good. And some masjids do it really well. And I've seen that everywhere. Alhamdulillah.
Yeah, and I'll say even myself, as an expat, I'd lived almost 3 years with my family in Colombia and in Bogota, and it's a beautiful, beautiful country full of welcoming and nice people. But you're essentially living in a country where there might be 60,000 Muslims in the whole country, and sometimes, other than Friday, other than the Jummah prayer, you might not always run into Muslims. So we really, really appreciated our Ramadans back in Houston, or back in bigger cities with big Muslim communities having masajid on pretty much every major street corner.
Was this in hindsight or was this
In hindsight?
Okay.
In hindsight, and it really hit me when my daughter actually she became she became 10, 11 years old in Colombia. She started wearing hijab. And it wasn't easy, even though Colombians are such friendly, welcoming people. You and me have so many good Colombian friends at Islam and Spanish who we love so much. But people would look at you kind of, like that's something new. And the stares, even if they're friendly stares,
Yeah.
they'll make a little girl uncomfortable. I remember my daughter would say, she's like, Baba, you think we could do next Ramadan in Houston? And I sometimes would ask her, why Houston? And she goes, there we just see so many people who wear hijab and so many Muslims. It was a small thing, but a little kid even noticed it. And so it was hindsight, and I didn't notice this as much because you're at work.
Right.
But when I heard my daughter, my kids talk about it, real interesting. Siraj, let me start with you on this one. How do you deal with sleep, and how do you manage sleep in Ramadan? And how do you get your body ready for that even before Ramadan?
So sleep is an interesting question, and I'm probably not going to be much help here because even outside of Ramadan, I have the worst sleep habits you can possibly imagine. And so I'm not going to try to give anyone any advice or try to make it look like I know what I'm talking about. Or at least I might know what the right thing to do is, but whether or not I practice it is another story. In Ramadan time itself, the one thing I will say that ends up happening is that towards the last 10 nights, my sleep gets really compromised and I end up just being a zombie throughout the day at work. And I'm blessed by the fact that I work remotely. So I can focus, I can get some work done quickly, I can turn that in, and then, I can sort of just wait the day out. So I'm not the person to ask questions about sleep, but I think maybe Bilal will be better suited to answer this one.
Bilal, same question. Sleep management, and what do you do? Does anything change? And especially ahead of Ramadan, what do you do to make sure you have some sort of sleep habit that lets you be productive in the month?
So I go into the month knowing that I'm going to get less sleep, without a doubt. One of the things that definitely helps is the midday nap, like hands down. Like taking a nap around like 3-ish, and then for about an hour, you wake up at 4. And that gives me just enough energy to kind of like push through. Because for me, like the major lull in the entire day is around 4 or 5 p.m. Right, that hour and a half or so before iftar. Everybody that I know, doesn't matter how fit or unfit they are, that last 90 minutes to 2 hours before iftar is like, I'm not doing anything, right? And for me, that's like, great, I'm not gonna do anything either, so let me go. And that's where doing something where you move your body, right? If you move, it'll automatically trigger your entire system to have a little bit more energy. Now, one of the things though that I also find is that if at any point in the day I'm feeling that dip, right, I just get up and go, like walk for like 12-15 minutes and then get back to what I was doing. Right now, I have the benefit of working remotely, but even when I was working in an office back in DC, like it wasn't a restrictive environment. So like as long as you're not in a meeting, you just wanted to get up and walk, like you could do that. And Georgetown was a beautiful place to walk around too also. So but yeah, like that's really it. Like, yes, you're gonna get less sleep, but when you haven't had enough sleep, your energy is gonna be low. But when you feel your energy going low, just move.
I like that. Siraj, is there something you do if you feel energy getting low? I know you were saying your sleep habits might not be the best, but the same question about when you recognize a body, the energy's getting low, something's happening in the day, do you, is there some trick you have or some strategy you have to kind of counter that?
I mean, the best counter is the one that Bilal already mentioned. You can't have caffeine. I mean, you shouldn't really use caffeine this way anyway. But I mean, the best thing you can do is probably catch a nap. I found that if I could take a short nap, maybe 15, 20 minutes at most, at the very most, if it goes beyond that, you're going to get blown. At least I'll get blown out. I don't know about anybody else, but 15 to 20 minutes is good for me. And then I can wake back up and carry on with the day. But if I go beyond that, like 30, 35 minutes, then I'm going to wake up and I'm going to feel very grumpy. So, and yeah, that's what I would recommend in general. Just get a nap if you can. And of course, if you work remotely, that's easier. If you're working in an office, before the pandemic, my office finally had like these little sleep pods in separate rooms, but they only had 2 of them. So people kind of had to timeshare it. I'm not sure what it is, that everyone else has. but try to find a place where you can put your head down for a bit, whether it's your desk or some other way. Obviously, factory workers might not have that luxury, but do your best and see what you can get.
Okay.
One of the things I just want to add, it really depends on where you're at, right? Like what I used to do in DC, I can't do in Houston. Like there's no way I'm stepping outside during the
You'll dehydrate.
no, forget about it. It's just hot. Even if you're not fasting, it's just nasty, right? But like in DC, like I was perfectly comfortable finding a park bench. There's a lot of parks, right? Especially like either by the Potomac on the river, or on the river steps, or by there are these little falls there. Finding a bench and just literally laying down. And funny thing was, one time somebody thought I was a homeless guy sleeping because I took my shoe off to use as a pillow, and somebody's like, "Are you?"
Oh man!
But then when I woke up, like, no, I'm just taking a nap. They're like, oh, "Okay, sorry, I thought you were a homeless person." So just be mindful of the environment. But yeah, but if it's nice out, like, yeah, I mean, it's easy to take a nap there.
No, for sure.
All right, so I got a question for both of you guys. So one of the fasting effects that occurs to me, the physical fasting effects, is my body temperature drops pretty low. I get really cold all the time. I've got the heater jacked up. I'm covered in like layers of clothes, and even that doesn't work. I might just end up standing and taking a hot shower multiple times in the day. Do you guys have the same thing happening? And if so, how are you coping and dealing with it?
I have not experienced that. At least not that I'm aware of.
No, not particularly the body temperature dropping. I mean, either. I wonder if that's because of activity for Siraj or something else. But
yeah, I mean, I don't know. I mean, in Houston, it's like if you're feeling cold, that means your AC is too hot.
Yeah.
Okay, you guys are in Houston. I forgot.
Yeah.
No, I have read that for some people who do intermittent fasting, because I looked it up, and the non-Muslims are all into intermittent fasting right now. So I did see that there were some people reporting like feeling cold whenever they did intermittent fasting. So, but it's not for everyone. It's for some people. Maybe I'm one of those people. But I was wondering if you guys had similar experience with that.
Do you experience that every Ramadan?
Yeah, every Ramadan, and even when I do intermittent fasting, like right now, I'm not even doing like, usually people do something like 16-8, or they might have one meal a day, something like that. I'm doing what I call 12-12, which is like I stop eating at 10 p.m. and I start eating again at 10 a.m., which is just a 12-hour fast, right? Just making sure there's no calories. And even with that, I feel pretty cold. So yeah, it hits me the moment I start cutting out calories.
So I think now that you've put it out there,
having coffee and water every day.
yeah, I think
Still
now
having coffee and water, but it still hits.
I think now that you put it out there, it's definitely something I'm going to watch for this Ramadan. But okay, I'm going to ask you, bros, a series of questions. Maybe on these we'll go a little rapid response because I think we're probably within about 10 minutes remaining in our show in this particular episode. Is different habits we may have around work or our daily routines in Ramadan. So I'll start with one myself, and I'll ask the same question to you guys. I have one habit that I've probably had for the last 5 or 6 Ramadans where I take Fridays off. Now, I work a job where I'm salaried. I fully understand some of the listeners may have hourly jobs and it's difficult to take time off because you lose pay. Totally sensitive to that. Some people may be students. You have classes Friday. You can't miss those. I totally get it. But for people who are able to, alhamdulillah, or they can, I try to take Fridays off. So you get the masjid a little earlier, maybe spend a little more time, take the kids if you have your kids with you or family, and then maybe sit for a little while after. Just maybe maximize that time on Friday. And this, obviously, in addition, maybe every single night you won't go to Tarawih. Maybe every single night you won't be able to do everything you want to do. But it's just something I do. Do either of you guys do that where you're just like, hey, Fridays in Ramadan are different, or something else, something of your schedule that you change up? Maybe on the odd nights you work from home or you take a day off. Bilal, let me start with you, and then Siraj, same question.
So, having been a remote worker since I came to Houston, I've always kept my Fridays light. So I'll work the morning, and then as soon as Jummah hits, for the most part, I'm not going to do
This is Ramadan or not? It doesn't matter.
Right. So when it comes to Ramadan, I kind of maintain that. Now, one of the things I aim for, what actually ends up happening is because I want to keep my Fridays light, and I'm working with a lot of Muslims as well. So Ramadan, my workload is like quintupled. So in order to maintain that light Friday, my Monday through Thursday is heavy. right? And so, and sometimes that'll spill over into the weekend, right? On like a Saturday, or maybe even like I'll just get a head start on it on Sunday. But one of the things I always try to do is last 10 nights, cut it all off, right? As much as possible, because I just want to focus on dua and salah, and like that's what the last 10 nights are for. And then I just binge out on the 3 Eid days.
No, I love it. And as I go to Siraj, I'll tell you, I know a lot of corporate guys who maybe they can't take the last 10 nights fully off, but they'll either do the odd nights off, or they'll cut half days. And yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. Siraj, same question. Whether Fridays or any sort of uh, adjusted schedule, is there something you do different with your routine? And I'm talking specifically about work and daily duties.
For the most part, I don't change it. I think, well, let me put it this way. If you could imagine like somebody interacting with me from work and it's a black box, they won't know what's going on. They'll get the same results every day. They're going to get all their work and they're going to get everything they've assigned me will be returned back to them the way they want it. But on the back end, underneath the hood, things are a little different, which is like, for example, the last 10 nights, yeah, you will be praying a little bit later into the night, but then you wake up a little bit later in the day and then you manage that day how you can. There's no specific like taking time off. I'm still working the day, but I might change my own habits and the way I go about like sleeping, waking, praying, interacting with family. Oftentimes during the last 10 nights, for example, unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on how you look at it, you might just end up staying up all night, eating suhoor, and then praying fajr, and then going to bed, and then catching whatever sleep you can, and then getting up for work. I've had that happen quite a few times. I'm not saying that's optimal, but that's something that happens with me, and maybe other people also have the same thing happening too.
No, I get it. So Siraj, I want to, with that, move into this topic under the same. We're talking here as three guys who are fathers. We're essentially the head of households, and this last question or topic could probably have been its own show. But I remember, I'm basically born and raised in Houston my whole life. I remember a generation of these amazing aunties, Desi and Arab aunties, who they were kind of like superheroes. They would, they're watching the kids, they're managing the household. In Ramadan, they're cooking for 15 people, sometimes every day, because you may have in-laws living next door, or family, and you'd always appreciate them. But looking back, I always feel like, man, that was their Ramadan too. It was their Ramadan too, where maybe the uncles head to the masjid, maybe the kids head to the masjid, but you had these amazing aunties, cooking 7, 8 dishes every day, and there's people coming over, and there's in-laws, and there's and obviously now looking back, we realize that probably wasn't ideal for them, even though they did it out of love and they did it. I want to ask you guys, in the times we live in, the generation we live in, what's an advice for fathers where how can we adjust household duties in Ramadan to where obviously our wives are going to have to do stuff in Ramadan. I mean, the house still goes on. We're going to have to do stuff in Ramadan, but at the same time, everyone wants to enjoy their Ramadan. Like Bilal said, he goes, "Man, my last 10 days, I want it to be about dua and ibadah," and I'm sure his wife would feel the same way. I'm sure my wife would feel the same way. So I want to ask you guys, like, what is that balance where we look out for our wives or our mothers or our mother-in-laws, where it's not, as much as we appreciate that tasty food and all the great stuff they do with love, but we want to balance it, or maybe we jump in. So I'd like to see what you guys think about that. And again, this could have probably been its own show, but I don't know, Siraj, if you want to start first on that one, or Bilal, whoever wants to go.
What's the question?
Is managing?
Yeah, I'll go first.
Go ahead, Siraj.
Yeah, I'm gonna go first. Yeah, I can go first on that one. So there's a lot there to unpack. So the aunties themselves and just people in general who are putting in a lot of time and effort cooking. I mean, hats off to them. There's a lot of appreciation there. I think when we see some of the discussions around this, there's certainly validity and truth to the idea that they're putting in a lot of time and effort. And maybe the people around them aren't exerting the same effort. One thing I would say is that the people who are actually making the food, the aunties who are making all this food, it will really depend on who you're talking to, whether or not they really resented that whole thing or not. Now, some of them will say, you know what, this is my contribution to Ramadan. My husband has his contribution, and I want to take care of my kids, and this is what I want to do. And some of them will even be offended if you come in and try to help them. And you have to respect that. When I say respect, I mean respect in the sense of like, if they want their boundaries respected, respect those boundaries. And what they may really want out of this whole thing is appreciation and recognition. There is room, however, to talk about situations where, your wife, your kids, whoever, they all have goals for Ramadan themselves. They want to get a certain amount of ibadah in, a certain amount of Quran in. So I think it's important that for us now, today, when we still talk about these issues, people can still make whatever food they're going to make. But if they have goals that they want to achieve, what we should be doing is talking to one another and trying to figure out how we can time manage that. So if somebody says, I want to do all this cooking here, but then on these hours, I want to come with you to the masjid and pray, and I want you to watch the kids. Well, there's an example of how you could like pray 8, take the kids, then she can pray 8 if you guys are okay with 8. If not, you can manage it maybe day by day. If you need to do like one person does 20 one day, one person does 20 another day, keeping in mind that these are all sunnah prayers, right? These are not like fard prayers that we're talking about. So you can timeshare and you can manage between yourselves how you're going to get that benefit, and how even let's say your wife wants to read the Quran, she wants to do her khatam, you can help her with the kids and say, I'll watch the kids if they're young and they can't take care of themselves. If they're older, of course, obviously they can take care of themselves. But when they're younger and they still need some help and some supervision, as a man, you can step up and say, I'll watch the kids while you do what you're going to do. And then when I want to do what I want to do, you watch the kids too. I think there's a lot of work and chores and tasks and responsibilities that everyone has. And we have to be careful of this. I think in general, we see this sort of like finger pointing, gender finger pointing that goes on, and people scoring points. I don't think it's about scoring points. I think everyone's working hard and everyone's trying their best. But maybe sometimes some people pull their weight a little more than others. And we can rebalance that by just sort of sitting down, planning together, and coming up with good solutions for how we can help one another accomplish our goals.
Yeah, no, well said. Bilal, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, it's interesting. So in my case, it's a little bit different. I'm kind of new to the game of fatherhood in the sense of my kid just turned 3. So, and we're a small nuclear family of my husband, wife, and 3-year-old kid. So at the same time, growing up, we didn't really have.
Bro, Mabruk, I didn't know you had a 3-year-old.
Oh yeah,
Mabruk.
Mashallah.
Yeah, so he just turned 3 in January, and even growing up, we didn't have like a big culture of food and feasting at home, right? And I think part of it is due to the fact that my dad's always been health conscious, and so even like
we see where you get it from. There.
Yeah, well, the thing is, even now, my dad like, you'll never impress a Desi dad. So it doesn't matter how health conscious you are, and in the case for my dad, it's more a preventative thing because diabetes runs heavily in the family, and even on my wife's side, several of her family members have diabetes too, and she's even on like glucose monitoring, right? And so turned out she was pre-diabetic, gestational diabetes when she was pregnant with Yusuf. So like that awareness and mindfulness for what we're eating, how much we're eating, what our glucose numbers are, is like very prominent in our home. So the idea of like food culture, it's not so much. Even with like regards to food, like when I'm hungry, I go make myself some food. I'm not expecting food to be made every night or day or whatever, right? Similarly, it's the same thing in Ramadan. Now, my wife at times, she's like, hey, I'm in the mood for making something like this. I'm like, yeah, sure, let's have it. When it comes to like chores and things like that, like we have a pretty like collaborative, I don't want to say division of labor. It's like, for me, in my case, like I'll do laundry, right? Because I don't want anybody else doing my laundry. It's just like a personal thing, right? Comes to dishes, like we'll just do the dishes. Like we have like a process, right? It's just like something's dirty, right? Just rinse it, put it in the dishwasher in the morning, take the stuff out. Whoever's there just does it. So it's not like, hey, did you do the dishes? Or like, we don't have that. But then again, we're a household of 2 adults and a toddler, so we don't really have to worry about that.
And I think I'll say on that, my house is the same in division of labor. I have twins that are teenagers, they're almost 15, an 11-year-old. There's a baby that's 10 months, and so he's excused from chores, but the 3 older ones. Okay, guys, we're at time. I'm going to ask one quick question to you guys to wrap up. It's just a quick answer. So we talked about a lot of physical preparation tips for Ramadan. We talked about sleep management, energy management. We talked about managing meals. I want to ask you guys, Ramadan is about 6 weeks away. When do you start the physical prep for Ramadan? And not just you personally, but what would you recommend listeners, and many of which might not do really intense workouts or things like jiu-jitsu? When should people ideally start planning for Ramadan?
Ideal scenario, start counting down 6 months. right now. Obviously now like we're like a month away, almost just over a month away as of this recording. One of the things I do like to do, and if you haven't done it now, is have a family shared calendar on your wall that goes at least 3 months, right? And for me, what I like to do is like when Ramadan is over, I'll start counting how many days has it been since Ramadan, right? And I'll mark it like at the 30-day mark, 30 days since, 60 days since, 90. And then and once we get to like the 6 month mark, I like to mark on that calendar, all right, 6 months until Ramadan, 5 months, 4 months, right? And I can see that number. So every time I'm in my home office, I see that calendar. I'm like, Ramadan is this far away, and so that's in my mind, and I try to hearken that to the tradition of the companions of how they would, they would say farewell to Ramadan 6 months, after, and then they would look forward to it 6 months prior.
Yeah.
So, I mean, that's for me just kind of a mindset thing, and the other thing is like I also plan, like people plan for vacations or weddings and things like that. I like to plan for what I'm going to do in Ramadan in terms of my contribution in Ramadan, how I'm going to worship. So this way I don't come into the month not like I know exactly how I want my month to go. Now, if you haven't done that, I would say take the time to do that now.
That's awesome. Make a plan. No, Jazakallah khair. Really, really good show. Bilal, I would love if in the future you come back and join us again. You're always welcome. And with that, Jazakallah khair. Another episode for Ramadan preparation. And I think we'll have one more before the month of Ramadan begins. So, brothers and sisters, hope you benefit from the show. And remember to follow the Muslim Matter podcast online. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam.